What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So the iPhone Air is a failure, officially. You don't have to just take my word for it. The reports we're seeing about Apple cutting production and even delaying a supposed follow-up, the iPhone Air 2, are more than enough to suggest that the demand for this phone is just not there. When you're Apple, anything less than an all-out bestseller certainly falls short of the expectations, I'm sure. But this feels like a complete and total miss, which is unusual, but not unprecedented. On the one hand, this is really disappointing to see. I mean, for years, we've all been clamoring for something new. An iPhone that's different, unique, generally just worth getting, as opposed to being stuck with seemingly the same phone year after year after year. The issues with the iPhone Air, however, or more appropriately, the compromises or the trade-offs, I think are too significant to look past. Furthermore, the iPhone Air isn't the only iPhone in the lineup, and it isn't even the only thin phone we've seen this year. So naturally, a whole bunch of comparisons are going to be made, and the iPhone Air just doesn't hold up against really any scrutiny whatsoever. Once you get past the initial wow factor of the phone's thinness, everything else just falls apart. And if we're being honest, the phone being thin isn't even enticing enough to begin with. The first issue for me with the iPhone Air is really just its price. I know we're all used to paying $1,000 for a smartphone now, and if this were the only iPhone offered, it probably wouldn't even matter as much. But this isn't the only iPhone offered, and it also isn't the cheapest. You can't really discuss price without also tossing in the specs and features, and I'll touch on all that stuff in a moment, of course, but we all know that the new regular iPhone 17 has an upgraded ProMotion display, finally, an additional camera lens, a bigger battery, and the same performance capabilities, all while being cheaper than this iPhone Air. And to the minimally informed consumer, that just doesn't make any sense. The iPhone Air should have probably been cheaper, but perhaps the premium materials and technological advances, like the camera plateau or new processor, increased its costs. If that's the case, maybe some additional compromises could have been made, though I'm not sure what more Apple could have taken away from this phone. To me, the iPhone Air should have been, and even sounds like, an entry-level or budget iPhone. If Air means, in this case, thinner and lighter, it shouldn't also be more expensive. And actually, Apple has similar naming and lineup confusions with the iPads. There's an iPad mini, a regular iPad, 2 iPad Airs, 2 more iPad Pros. There's a little more consistency in the spec and feature hierarchy as you go up the lineup. But again, the iPad Air isn't the cheapest, unlike the MacBook lineup, which for now is back to 2 options, the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, which makes perfect sense. Unless having the cool new super thin iPhone is important to you, it literally makes no sense to spend more when the regular new iPhone 17 is the better and cheaper device overall. The other glaring issue with the iPhone Air, in my opinion, is that this phone's thinness doesn't really solve any problems. Is it kind of cool how thin this phone is when you see it next to the regular 17 and 17 Pro? Sure, I guess. But size-wise, it's a 6.5-inch device, which is actually larger than the regular 17 and just a little smaller than the 17 Pro Max. That's great if you want a big screen, and in fact, this is actually the only other iPhone size you can choose from now. The regular iPhone Plus is dead. The iPhone mini, of course, is long gone, so I suppose an additional perk of getting the Air is that you do get a bigger sized screen. And okay, sure, the thin phone kind of makes reaching the corners and edges of that bigger screen a little easier. It's a slightly more comfortable phone to hold, but it's still too big for my pocket, at least. It's kind of uncomfortable here, which is why I've stuck with the regular-sized iPhone Pros the last few years now. Being thin isn't like being small, like the iPhone mini was, RIP. But we saw that people didn't want a small-sized phone either, even though that literally solved the size dilemma. That at least was a solution. This iPhone Air, I mean, I don't know anyone who's ever said an iPhone was too thick for them. And in fact, people would probably prefer a thicker, meatier phone nowadays if it meant a bigger battery, better performance, or the lack of a big old camera bulge. If there's one positive to the iPhone Air, it's that this is probably the nicest iPhone material-wise in the lineup now. It looks more like the iPhones of yesteryear. Polished mirror-like titanium finish, classic frosted glass in a very muted color. This is the sky blue, by the way. It reminds me of the iPhone X, which isn't a bad thing. That was a beautiful phone. But if we're to believe Apple, this combo of components is worse than the old but new aluminum form factor of the iPhone Pro. It's honestly getting hard to keep up at this point. And you know what? I'll give the iPhone Air a few more props. The A19 Pro processor is better than the regular A19 chip in the new iPhone 17, so that's cool, and you do get 12 gigabytes of RAM. The bigger display is also the LTPO Super Retina XDR OLED ProMotion panel with the upgraded brightness. So no compromises there at all. The front glass is also Ceramic Shield 2. It's still IP68 water and dust resistant. For all intents and purposes, it's way closer to the Pro iPhone in a lot of ways. But in a lot of other ways, it's not even close to the regular iPhone. The single speaker on the bottom of the iPhone Air sucks. I guess Apple couldn't cram anything else within the top third of this phone. You don't get that secondary loudspeaker, and you notice the difference immediately. And the most obvious thing that's lacking, camera lenses. The iPhone Air has one rear camera, the 48 megapixel standard lens. It's the upgraded version that's found on the regular iPhone 17, not quite as good as the Pro, but more importantly, you don't get anything else here. No wide angle like the regular iPhone 17, obviously no telephoto like what's on the Pro, and because of the hardware limitations, or just sheer lack of lenses, you lose a ton of functionality. I think a wide angle lens is super useful. I use it all the time. I also think better zoom can be handy in some cases too. Using the camera on this phone feels super limiting, even though it arguably does still take great pictures and videos. Apple did give the Air the new selfie camera that can take landscape selfies, so that's nice at least. And look, I know they can only cram so much stuff within that revolutionary camera plateau. And actually, if we're to believe the rumors, Apple is apparently trying to cram in another lens into the iPhone Air 2, if there ultimately is a follow-up to this phone. And the conspiracy theorist in me, and I'm sure some of you guys too, thinks that these companies purposefully leave off stuff so they can upgrade the device the following year more effortlessly. The big question you have to ask is whether or not this single lens camera setup is a deal breaker. For me, I feel like it is. At least there's no crappy macro mode, which some people have pointed out since there's no lens switching. But considering how much emphasis Apple puts on pictures and videos nowadays, and how used to certain features people probably are, I can't imagine many people are okay taking potentially multiple steps backwards. By far, the biggest beef people have with this iPhone Air is battery life, obviously, so let me talk a little bit about that. If you're just going off the spec sheets, the iPhone Air's 3,149 mAh capacity is about 500 mAh less than the regular iPhone 17, 1,000 mAh less than the Pro, more or less, and like 2,000 mAh off from the slightly larger but much, much thicker 17 Pro Max. It's the smallest battery life in the lineup this year. And I don't think anyone is surprised by this. I mean, it's a thinner phone, so Apple could only cram so much battery capacity inside. Plenty of people have made the argument that better battery tech should have been the solution here, or maybe waiting a year or two until better battery tech was available or more affordable. But the cold hard truth is that battery life is sort of subjective. It's totally up to you whether the iPhone Air is sufficient or if it's going to be dead by noon. You know how much you use your phone, and you know whether or not you need a big battery. So saying the iPhone Air has bad battery life is more of a you problem than an outright issue with this phone. If you buy the iPhone Air and you're coming from a Pro Max and you're shocked when you can't make it through the day, sorry, that's just on you. Yes, Apple shouldn't have compromised on battery life so much, since it's probably the single most important element to using a phone. I mean, it is its literal power source. But if you're a light user or even an average user, it's going to make it through the day with 6 or 7 hours of screen on time. And I think Apple has implemented enough software stuff to optimize battery usage and battery health. So after a couple of weeks, battery life might even be a little better when it starts to learn your usage patterns. I'll be honest, the battery size was one of my first criticisms of this phone. I scoffed at the fact that this had a smaller battery size than literally any iPhone since like the Mini, seriously. But looking at this with some perspective, it's sort of a no-duh moment. It's a thin phone. Of course it's going to have a smaller battery if the battery itself isn't new or different. You just have to taper your expectations with that if you're into something slim. Over the last few years, I've been far from an Apple apologist. In fact, I don't think I've had a good thing to say about any of the recent iPhones. They've been the same year after year, and until this year, I've never really recommended them outright. The 17 lineup, though, this year is great. Substantially different, with solid upgrades, finally. The one phone that isn't worth it, though, is this iPhone Air. And I sort of had to ask myself, why does this phone even exist? I mean, it isn't the only thin phone on the market, so maybe these companies, including Apple, feel that thin is in. Or maybe this is just the best that they could come up with that's different or new without being totally niche and way overpriced, like a foldable, for example. Though once again, if we're to believe the rumors, a foldable iPhone is coming eventually. And if you're familiar with one of the other super slim phones, Samsung's S25 Edge, some folks have suggested that that phone's thin profile and components were a precursor to the very thin new Fold 7 that launched shortly after this one. That the Edge from Samsung was in development for a couple of years and was sort of a byproduct of wanting their foldable to be thinner, or maybe vice versa. So maybe, just maybe, the iPhone Air is one half of a future iPhone Fold, and this was a byproduct or proof of concept that came to fruition in the interim. Whatever the case may be, this iPhone Air unfortunately seems to be a failure on its own, which is a shame, but not totally unexpected. And it'll be interesting to see what, if anything, comes of the iPhone Air. Whether there's an iPhone Air 2, an iPhone Fold, if the Air becomes the entry-level iPhone, or maybe people wind up wanting thicker and thicker devices. I could certainly use a 10,000 mAh battery inside a big beefy smartphone instead. But what do you guys think of the iPhone Air? Did any of you buy it? If so, do you like it? And if not, would you even consider it? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.